thanks everyone for coming along. It's wonderful to see such a big audience, and I think this, it does show there is something in the air about this. I'm going to make something a little bit more of an argument as to both why we haven't got anything really that looks like basic income pretty much anywhere, despite it being around for a very long time, and why, despite that, it's kind of useful to talk about it and try to advance it. And in doing that, I want to contrast it with the two things that we do have historically and around the world which tried to solve the same problem that basic income is trying to solve, which is that capitalism is very unequal and very insecure. And so for a lot of people, it is intolerable to allow markets to operate as they ordinarily would without anything else being done to them. To address those two problems, that causes immense political instability. And so we've eventually got various forms of compromise that try to make it a little bit more functional and stable. So one of the solutions to that is basic income. We can just make sure that if we start and we say, well, the problem is that there might be some people who don't have enough stuff and they don't know whether they're going to have enough stuff from day to day or week to week or month to month. Well, an easy way to solve that is just to make sure we'll just give everybody enough money to go and buy enough stuff, and we'll make that a basic right for everyone. That solves the problem. Yeah? And in a sense, it seems like the most obvious solution if that's the problem. And that clearly has been a problem that progressives have been thinking about for a couple of centuries now. But we haven't done that. It was discussed, as Troy has informed me as well. We've had some great conversations about this, and it was explicitly discussed by the Labor Party in the post-war years in the UK, and they didn't come up with that. They came up with this other thing called the welfare state. And it's been discussed at various points, including in Australia's history, and we didn't come up with it. We came up with this other thing called full employment. So they're the two big ways that you can solve it, so that aren't the basic income. So remember, we've got to think people don't have enough stuff and they don't know whether they're going to get enough stuff. So one way is to say, well, the way that people get income is through the labour market. What we're going to do is what academics would call pre-distribution. We're going to make sure that the incomes that people get from the market are more equal and more stable, and we'll do that by regulating markets in ways that ensure that people get what they need out of the market. Full employment is essentially that. That is, we'll make sure that everyone who wants a job gets a job, and we'll make sure that those jobs are decently paid. And to be honest, once you've made sure that everyone who wants a job gets a job, it's not that hard to ensure they all get decently paid, because you've massively increased their bargaining power with employers, because they know that they can leave a bad employer and go get another job down the road the next day. So that's one way you can solve that problem. And another way you can solve the problem is to say, well, what's the stuff that people want? So people need a house, they need education, they need healthcare. So let's just give them that stuff. We'll give them rights to the things that they need rather than to the money they could use to buy those same things in markets. So why don't we do that instead? And that's actually what the Scandinavian welfare state's essentially built on, what large chunks of the Australian welfare state's built on. So I think the first question we should ask is, why historically and around the world do we end up with those two other solutions and not the basic income? Before I'm going to go on to the challenge of why I think it's a good idea despite that fact. And I think it comes to the bit that Frank ended with. It turns out that going to an election saying I want to give everyone a job or I want to give everyone free healthcare is much, much more popular than going and say I just want to give everyone a lot of money. So it's a much more politically sustainable proposition. It's easier to build constituencies around. For those welfare state things, health's really expensive, but I'm going to give you a little thought experiment about how expensive a basic income will be, and the defence budget doesn't cover it. So shall we just start with, we'll abolish the defence force and the police forces and we still won't have enough money. And you'll kind of work out why it might be a difficult one to sell politically. I'm going to come to why there might be some solutions to that too. But that's a big part of it. I think it also goes to things which are really intrinsically human about us. So there's some great studies that show that people who are unemployed have really bad mental health outcomes. But those same people once they reach a certain age and get entitled to the pension, have better mental health outcomes, even if their incomes don't increase. There is something about employment which is about our identity and who we are and how we fit into a community, which is more than just about the money, and which is why I think that the trials that we have seen show that people keep working even if the basic income is actually adequate. And there isn't a drop-off in people working. The only two groups that do have a drop-off are, and this is back in the 70s, so imagine we're back in the 70s, are young working class men who decide to stay at school and are women who decide to stay home with their kids. So entirely socially useful, that you would say, and in fact investment-oriented types of behaviours. But most people keep on working. People like working, and they like having being part of a community. So I think even if we are going to deal with the basic income question, we can't give up on the employment question. I think the next point for that is politically, if you go to anywhere, any factory where people are earning 60 grand a year and say, don't worry, the robots are going to take your job, we're going to guarantee you a $20,000 a year payment, you won't win. And $20,000 a year is at the upper end of what we're going to afford. Yeah? This cannot replace those real jobs. It just can't. Sounds like I'm arguing against basic income. Don't worry, I'm going to get there and say I think it's a really good idea soon. So let's just think about the costs for a moment. So let's say that we want to give everyone an income that's at least 25% of the average. Yep. That's what we're going to do. 25% of the average income is what people are going to get. Maybe it's 20% because this is the average income, not just the average wage. So let's say 20% we'll say that's enough. So 20% of the average, if you gave it to everyone, is 20% of GDP, right? That's just the definition of it. Yeah? And total taxation of state, local and federal governments at the moment is what, about 35% of GDP? Yeah. So there you go. You've got a bit of an idea. So you'll save a little bit of money from our very generous welfare system. You'll save a little bit, you won't save much because we have a very targeted welfare state. It's not actually that generous and it's not that big. The next part you have to remember is that, so because it's a targeted welfare state, so we give unemployment benefits, parenting payments, disability support payments, age pension payments. They're all means tested, yeah? So when we get the means test off, most of those people don't get any more money. The only people who get more money are the current people who exceed the means test. That is, the richer people. So the main effect of this in dollar terms, and I think there's some other very important not dollar terms, but in terms of just actual money going in and out of places, most of the additional spending will be on middle and high income earners. They're the people who will be entitled to this payment who aren't currently entitled to anything under our current welfare state. So I think you're now starting to grasp why maybe this wasn't the idea that everyone seized upon when they heard it and when they actually got into governments and started working out how they were going to do things. When the proposal to Cabinet came to, at that point, double taxation and then give half of it to rich people, strangely, Cabinet didn't all go, that's a wonderful idea, we should go take that to the next election. So instead, they tried to get people jobs and they got them free healthcare and free education. Now, the last bit I'm going to say about why it's a bit of a problem before I move on is what happens, and I think the capital grant example is a good one because it concentrates the problem. So what would happen if we gave every 18-year-old 50 grand, for example? Probably needs to be more like 100 grand, but whatever it is. What would happen? Well, we live in Sydney. We know what's likely to happen. House prices would go up. And so a whole bunch of those people still wouldn't be able to get a house, even with their 100 grand. One of the main things it would do is bid up the prices of all those things people really need rather than just want. And that's kind of what's happened with Commonwealth rent assistance. So if you look at what we've done with housing, we stopped providing people with housing directly. We still do a bit of that, but we've been massively taking money out of that sector for about 30 years now, with some short, bright sparks of intervals in between, which almost all coincide with recessions. And instead of that, we decided to give more money to people to be able to pay for their rent in the private rental market, which is what Commonwealth Rent Assistance is, and you get access to rent assistance. And it's now pretty clear that one of the things that did was to push up rents, and that at least part of that payment is essentially paid to landlords. Because that's what happens in private markets for essential goods. Give people a subsidy to buy private health insurance. What happens to the cost of private health insurance? Yeah, we subsidise private schools, and we know that all of their prices have come down dramatically. So what happens when you subsidise rents? Well, the rents go up, yeah? And this is, I think, one of the real problems about this is, again, we want to give people access to some stuff that they really need. If you give them money to buy that stuff in private markets, you inflate the cost of those essential goods and services, and you transfer at least some of that resource to the people who monopolise those positions, to landlords, to the insurers, and to people who control elite private schools. That's what you do. And so historically, that's why one of the reasons we did the welfare state was we said, well, we're just going to kind of stop you from being able to do that by taking away your rights to control entry to these goods. We're going to nationalise land, we're going to nationalise a health service, and we're going to nationalise education. And by doing that, we can control those producer-provider incomes that have kind of a monopoly control over the entry into these things that we all need, and therefore we have to pay for no matter what happens. So, that's why I don't think that it's happened today. How on earth do I think it's a good idea to do it now? Because I do think it's actually a good idea. I think we should go out and campaign for it. I'm sure you're all inspired to do that now. So I don't think that these things are trade-offs. And one of the ways, particularly that the right do talk about basic income, almost all the people who are like, Hayek talked about this, Friedman talked about this, almost all of them see it as a trade-off. So they say, well, what we're going to do is we're going to liquidate the welfare state and we're going to give you a payment back. So you won't have Medicare, you won't have public schools anymore, you won't have a public transport system. We'll take all that money and we'll just divide it evenly between everyone, and that's going to be your basic income. You can go and buy those services back from private markets. That's essentially what they said. And I think if you see it like that, and particularly if you ever politically frame it like that, it is a complete disaster and we should have absolutely nothing to do with it, and we should campaign really hard against it. But I don't think that's what happens in real life. In real life, you think about those things. So I'm going to say, let's think about basic income as a lack of conditionality on the payments that the government gives. So that what's central to it is that you don't need to persuade anyone that you're entitled to it. You don't need to fill in any forms, you don't have to meet an activity test, you don't have to be monitored by the government and then get them to release your personal information to the media. You don't need to do that. Yeah, that's a crucial element of it, and I'm going to say that's one of the key pieces. And if we look at the last 30 years around the world, and we look at full employment, and we look at the welfare state, and we look at conditionality of payments, that wasn't really a trade-off most of the places. They just all went backwards. Yeah? And as one of them went backwards, so it became harder to fight for the others. As unemployment went up, so it became harder to get less conditional payments. And so it became harder to be able to get universal public service provision. So might it work the other way too? Might it be that the fight to make Medicare, to expand Medicare, so it actually includes things like dental and optical, rather than introduce payments for the bits we've already got, actually be the same fight to be able to get basic working conditions and better industrial relations laws and a less conditional system of government payments? And I think it probably is. I think those things are connected. And I think particularly that the extreme conditionality we now see around the unemployment benefit is one of the things that makes it very, very hard to fight for other wins in the labour market. So we shouldn't think about it as being a solution to automation. It's not going to help the person who's being paid 60 grand a year, who's going to lose their job and go on 20 grand a year. But it is going to help the person who currently doesn't have a job, who is currently on Newstart, to get more money, have more dignity, and to face less scrutiny from the government and have more genuine independence. Yeah? So if that's what we're fighting for, the reason I think basic incomes, like I say, well, why don't you just fight for that? Why don't we just say we should make, well, let's raise Newstart? Turns out lots of people have said we should raise Newstart. Judith Sloan has said we should raise Newstart. The Business Council has said, yeah, it's not a bad idea to raise Newstart. Have we raised Newstart? So it turns out that having a political battle where you go to an election and say, what we want to do is increase payments for unemployed people is a political disaster. Doesn't work. But when you say that we should pay everyone some basic amount of money, lots of people go, oh, that's a great idea. Why don't we do that? Basic income is infinitely more saleable than a really big problem that we currently have. That is, how do we make the welfare state fairer, treat people with dignity, and less conditional? And so I think it has to be the centre of that fight. I also don't think that it is necessary that we pay all of that money all up front. In fact, there's a bit of a history. I think we might say there's bits of the Australian welfare state that kind of look like the response you give when you're in neoliberal times. And you should wind me up, Mary, if I'm...
No, that's all right. I will. Got 10 minutes.
Okay. Well, I'll be under that. And so we used to, the unemployment benefit, if you go back quite a long time ago, if you got like an hour's work and your income went up, you just lost the whole lot, right? That's actually a crazy system, but it made a lot of sense if all the jobs were full-time. So you're either employed or you're not employed. You either get a full-time wage or you get nothing. You have the unemployment benefit kind of mimic that. And one of the processes that went on during that long period of economic reform, much of which was horrendous, but one of the interesting responses to it, which was quite good, I think, was to say, well, we want to look at what the marginal effect is on someone getting one extra hour of work. Because we know there's lots of people in part-time work, and we're really worried that when they take an extra shift at work, they lose even more money from losing Newstart than they get from working their extra shift. They're not going to work the extra shift. We have a really profound example of this in public housing at the moment because we have such an insecure private rental market that the security rights of public housing are worth a lot. Right? If you're on a low income, private rental market is horrendous. Like, it puts people in hospital. So that means you can't be in public housing and get a job, basically now. The cutoff's too low. So if you're in public housing, you shouldn't get employed. Like, it's really bad for you to go and get a job. That is horrendous that that's the case, because it's actually really good for you generally to get a job. But at the moment, we have this really, really bad system. And that's what happens when you kind of have these very harsh means tests on things. So we started to change a lot of our payments. We didn't really change Newstart that much, but some of the other payments we had, we did start to mirror along these lines. And I think family benefits and the age pension are the two examples which stand out as being relatively good. So both of them are reasonably adequate. Not brilliant, but they're reasonably adequate by the standards of the Australian system. And both of them have quite generous means tests. That is, that you can earn a little bit of extra money and you don't get cut off straight away. As they phase out, they don't phase out all at once. Family benefits in particular actually even have one phase-out rate, then they let you earn some more money, then have another phase-out rate, to ensure that middle-income earners still get some. So most people over 65 get some age pension. They might not get all of it, but they get some age pension. Most families with children get some family benefits. Don't get all of it, but they get some of it. Now, have a bit of a think about that politics. Those payments are both more adequate than Newstart. They're both more generous than Newstart, and they cost more than it. So we've had an attack on the welfare state. Surely the first targets were the age pension and family payments. They were the things that governments went after. Yeah, because that's where the real money is. No. In fact, they were the age pension was the only payment that the Labor government and the Liberal government made decisions to increase. They did the same thing with family payments. We're seeing a bit of a freeze on that at the moment, but if you take from 2000, both sides of politics have discretionarily, that is, they've made decisions, not just indexation, they've made active decisions to increase those payments. They were already the highest in the systems, and they were the most expensive, and they were given to the most people. So it turns out, if lots of people get a payment, politicians like increasing it. And if no one gets a payment, politicians like targeting it, particularly if those people are poor. Obviously, if those people are very rich, they don't do that. So one of the best ways to defend groups of poor and disadvantaged citizens is to construct policies that give them a benefit, but where the group that are the beneficiaries is much, much bigger and is identified as a group that most people like. And every citizen in the country is a group most people like. So it creates a completely different political dynamic, so much so that Conservative parties see it as in their interest to increase it. Yeah? So much so that Le Pen thinks it's in her interest to increase it. Right? This is the entire political spectrum other than that handful of orthodox economists. Like, there's seriously only people left who don't agree with that logic across the entire political spectrum. So if we could move this system in that direction, we would build the political will that was necessary to start raising tax revenue. When politicians need to do something, look at what happened with Nauru. It's enormously expensive. Look at what happened in Iraq. When politicians realise it's in their political interest to spend money, they find the money. Don't worry about it. We don't need to worry about that. What we need to do is build a political case for why they think they should spend this money, and they will work out how to get the money. So this is a way I think we can convince some people of doing that. I don't think it's easy. And in fact, I think it's very hard, and I think the chances are we won't do it. But that's the case for every reform. I think it's relatively slightly easier than some of the alternatives we have. And I think as we do it, it strengthens our case to get better labour laws, and it strengthens our case to do Medicare. In fact, it becomes in the government's interests to be able to control the prices of all those things people buy because they're in an index that increases the cost of the basic income. So they want to try and contain those costs in order to be able to contain the amount of money they spend on the basic income. Gives them great incentives. So how do we actually do this? Well, and this is where I'll finish. 2 very brief points. So the first, I think, is we've got a couple of them. One of them is the age pension. I think we should do all we can to make the age pension more universal and to lower its age. And lower its age. We should completely oppose anything that increases its age, and I think we should start talking about why we should lower it. I think the argument we have for that is that that's fair and just. The argument that we can mount out in the streets to the economists, I think, is that we want people to be working longer. We know that it's very hard to get a new job once you turn 50. And we want to support people to be more enterprising and entrepreneurial in the labour market. And this does that. That's true, by the way. I'm not making it up. But it will give people more confidence to be able to do that. Universalising the pension will also make it easier for them to take extra income without losing their pension. It improves incentives. If you really universalise a pension, it would also mean you don't have to worry about that thing about your own home being outside the pensions means test, because there wouldn't be a pensions means test. And we could just get rid of that debate without having to cut half of the people's pensions in the country because they own a home that suddenly became really expensive. So I think that's one thing we can do. I think the other thing we should do is we shouldn't be too hung up on the fact that everyone actually gets the money. I think what we can think about this as a kind of tax offset. There's lots of other ways that we can, in fact, that's what these things are. That's why they invented this language. That's why when they increased the tax-free threshold to $20,000 almost no one got any extra money because everyone kind of already had it as a tax offset, which was kind of built into the existing tax scales. But what that means is that when you earn over a certain amount of money, we deem that your basic income has been given to you by the market, and so we don't give it to you again. It's a way of building in the tax rates required to pay for it into the payment itself. So instead of introducing a new series of taxes, what we do is we introduce a clawback rate on the payment. But to tell you the truth, I've never been able to tell the difference between when I paid 10 cents extra in tax or lost 10 cents in benefits. Feels very similar to me. But it turns out that when you pay 10 cents extra in tax, that increases the size of the state and is really bad. But when you lose 10 cents in benefits, that shrinks the size of the state and is really good. That's obviously a silly argument, but I think let's just go with it for the sake of this to try and get it up. And that's the only way I think it's going to happen in a way that's at all affordable. So they're my ideas for how you might start to do this, why I think it's still a good idea, despite the fact that no one's ever really liked this up until now. Thanks very much.